we recording? Okay, we're live.
Live.
All right, we're live from the Kiln Littleton. And so Kiln is one of our portfolio companies. Shout out to Kiln. And this is fun for us to record one of these interviews, our first one from Colorado.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Matt and I have been
The maiden guest in Colorado. I love it.
Yeah. I'll give a quick background on our move to Colorado. So, we moved here. I moved 3 years ago. Matt's been here for a couple of years, and we have an office in Lodi. And one of the reasons why we moved to Colorado was to increase our investment activity in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And really, when we look back at our investment activity, we see we did an investment in a Colorado-based company in Fund 1.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't do anything in Fund 2. And then with Fund 3, it started to go up by about 5% of our allocation per fund to Colorado per fund. So we've grown to about 25% to 30% of Fund 6 going into Colorado. And, we wanted to highlight one of the best investments we've ever made in the state, which is Sondermind. And so, you have built an amazing company here. And we were fortunate enough to participate in, I believe, every single round of the company.
Yeah, every round.
Yeah. So when we first met, you were connected to Gavin Christensen, the founder of Kickstart, through grad school days and common connections. And, in those first days, we saw a company that had a services component. It was office space for clinicians, therapists. And you had a vision for what this was going to come. In fact, just before we started recording, we looked over the original pitch deck that we had. And it was remarkable how much your vision has remained consistent, really. It's hard to do that as an entrepreneur because you have to constantly adapt to the market, but your vision's been very consistent. But we eventually got involved once we saw it. We were able to wrap our mind around it and create a hypothesis around this kind of a network or a marketplace business. And, similar to the Uber of, we saw lots of these Uber of. This is, could have been described as the Uber of mental health services.
Although I never said that.
Yeah, forgive us. Yeah, but I think venture capitalists oftentimes are trying to put things in categories that we can understand. And
you're trying to pattern match.
Yeah, we're trying to pattern match, and we're trying to say, okay, what's the really compelling business model here? And so I guess without kind of extending this introduction any longer here, I'd love to ask you kind of, tell us a little bit about the early days of Sondermind. So I just kind of alluded to it, but what brought you to that point? And if you want to spend some time talking about different ventures you had tried, why were you prepared to articulate a vision in 2017, 2018 for the future of mental health care in this country? And why were you able to be so accurate? That's, it comes from prior experience. So love to hear how you positioned yourself and why you were in that spot back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like by the time we met, right, which, as you mentioned, Gavin and I were business school classmates. So we knew each other a bit from business school, and I was probably a little bit closer with maybe a couple other of your portfolio company founders who were business school classmates. And then a different partner was the partner who led the round, right? And he had a background in healthcare and some marketplace businesses and things like that. And so you again, you said this earlier before we started the podcast, a little less about the company. I mean, enough because we've been involved for a while now, for 8 years.
But I was never on your board.
You're never on the board, and so what's interesting, I think, is that 2017, 2018, I was already deep into mental health stuff by then, right? And so you have to go actually further back in time to answer that question. So the lead into that is basically just to permit myself to go further back in time.
Yeah.
So maybe, I mean, if it's helpful for the listeners, I'll go all the way back in time, which is, I studied computer science and went to West Point for undergrad, and then, like everybody who goes to a service academy, you're commissioned into the military, right? And so I was commissioned. I then moved to Colorado for my first duty station at Fort Carson, which, from where we are here, it's about 45 minutes due south from where I live in central Denver. It's about an hour, depending on traffic. And add traffic, it could be easily 2. And so I was stationed at Fort Carson for 5 years, except for 1 year over in Iraq. And when I got out of the Army, I went to business school, and that's where Gavin and I met. And then I did investment banking for a couple of years, and my partner at the time was a nurse. She became a nurse practitioner, and so I saw healthcare through her eyes as a provider, right? As operating in hospital settings and private practice settings. As a nurse practitioner, she operated in private clinics and ran private clinics, and and that was what interested me in healthcare, besides that it's a big, gnarly industry that's very inefficient, to say the least, and, has a lot of problems that could be solved. And so when I left business school, I did investment banking and I focused on healthcare mergers and acquisitions. After a couple of years, I realized that wasn't like the long-term thing for me. Interestingly, not for the normal reasons I think people leave banking or consulting, which is like, oh, the lifestyles stinks and you're working all the time. And I actually like, I mean, I obviously I can you went into like the next thing where, lifestyles things, which is like entrepreneurship. Um, but it was more because I just realized at the end of the day, as a senior investment banker, I actually liked the work of an associate or VP, right? Like running the deal, doing the analysis, like kind of analyzing the strategy, all that sort of stuff. As a senior banker, you're doing that as well, but really you make your hay as a relationship manager, right? Like that's the job.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. I have a lot of very good friends and we work with a lot of bankers. But I just like, I went to West Point to lead people, right? In retrospect had more of an entrepreneurial sort of background that I probably even gave myself I had awareness of or give myself credit for. And we can talk about that if it winds that way, but we don't need to. Um, and so I left and I came here and I started a company not far from where we are here, originally called Denver Cyberknife. So I started, I called it Denver Cyberknife. I changed the name a couple of years in, which was a whole learning experience with rebranding. And it was a very public facing thing. I had TV commercials and all that sort of stuff to Inova Cancer Care, still treating patients today with brain tumors, lung cancer, prostate cancer. Built a management service organization around that called Next Oncology and ultimately sold that business in 2015. So that was healthcare services, right? That's like treating patients with cancer. And I employed nurses and medical physicists and radiation therapists and partnered with doctors and radiation oncologists and neurosurgeons and things like that. But very much in healthcare, right? It was like you're delivering care. And then there's another company that about a year and a half into that one, I actually started on the side called Safe Image MD. And that was basically a software platform for storing and sharing and viewing medical imaging data.
Okay.
So think of it as like Dropbox for CT and MRI, right? It started like I had one of my former employees who was a medical physicist, and then went on to get another PhD in bioengineering with a focus on imaging informatics. He and I, and then a third co-founder of that business, a guy named Sid Dennis, who became my first CTO of Sondermind, we started this thing nights and weekends. We built this up to profitable business. It was one of three companies in the space at the time. We didn't raise any outside capital. We talked about it. We had investors coming out to us and saying, "Hey, like we want to invest in the space." And so I got a little taste of how like the fundraising stuff worked, on the VC side, because the first one was not a VC backed company. It was, a couple of private investors. And but it had a 12x return, so it was a VC type return for that first one. And the second one, we ultimately sold it. But I give the background more because that one was specifically healthcare technology, right? I mean, it was dealing with a file format that is only in healthcare, DICOM. DICOM is the file format for medical imaging data, and the transfer protocol as well. A very technical product at a time when the industry didn't, I mean, the industry, the healthcare industry broadly, and even the technology industry did not understand sort of the needs of the healthcare space. And I say that to just like for the listeners who don't understand how like in the dark ages healthcare was even in 2010, is that in 2009 there were still incentive payments from Medicare that they had put in place a couple of years earlier to basically pay doctors hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to start using an electronic health record system. To put that into context, that means the majority of physicians in the country in 2008, 2009, 2010 were still using paper charts, right? And so this is, I mean, like, you're like, wait, that wasn't that long ago, right? You think of like paper charts, you go, that was probably in the 90s. No, that was 15 years ago. And the idea of, HIPAA compliance and like cloud services was still very new. I mean, Dropbox in 2010, 2011, like, you said like the Uber, like the Dropbox 4, sometimes you talk to providers or physicians with that and they were like, what's Dropbox? It was that, the idea of cloud storage and things that was still pretty new in 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
And so Sondermind was was this combination. You mentioned like the service component, and we have a service component. Like, we treat people with, with mental health conditions, right? We have thousands and thousands of providers and psychiatrists, and our mission is to improve mental wellness, right? Is to improve their outcomes, right? And to enable our providers, all these therapists and psychologists to deliver better care. And so that's a service element, right? But then Safe Image was this technology component. So the background of that was, how can you use data and really unique technology tools to actually make care more efficient, right? So with Safe Image, it was, how can neurosurgeons and medical oncologists and other people not have to worry about the CD that the patient brings in, and if they don't bring it, it's a wasted session, it's a wasted consult or whatever. How can we make it easier to get second opinions? So Sondermind was a lot of that. And then there's a whole nother component of like, well, why get into mental health, which is probably where your question was emanating from. But let me pause if there's.
No, I think this is really helpful because, most entrepreneurs, one, they oftentimes imagine that you kind of meander a bit and then you find your thing, but you've had some successes, it wasn't just like, oh, we started this and then shut it down. You've had a number of things that are still going
Well, they're
concern.
baked with failures all inside of them, right? I mean, it's like the entrepreneurial journey is, even the successful ones are just a combination of failures until success,
Yeah.
right? That's really what it is,
Yeah.
So the first one wasn't like, oh, it was successful from day one. It was, for the first 18 months, I had perpetually about 6 to 10 weeks of payroll at any given point in time. I was on the phone with the local business bank who we had borrowed a bunch of, so we had financed it with a lot of debt as well, and I had personally guaranteed that debt as had my outside investor. So if it went bankrupt, I was declaring personal bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So for 18 months, I was on the phone about every 2 to 3 weeks with the banker because I had a line of credit and I had it based against different like parts of my accounts receivable, and I had to update my model, and I had to sort of like borrow and repay all the time. And that was while running the business. And I was CFO. I mean, it was like I was doing all this stuff myself. But I mean, it was on the brink of failure for a year and a half,
Yeah.
easily.
Yeah.
Safe
And
Image
you
MD.
kept a great head of hair through all of it.
Well, I don't know. It's really gray now, right? So it, I definitely lost some. I mean, I think the army let me lose enough hair too.
I want to actually press on that a little bit.
Yeah.
So here in Colorado, we see a lot of defense tech,
Mhm.
space tech, companies led by veterans
Yeah.
and people, with experience in the military. And you've talked about how one of the core drivers when you were a banker, you said, I want to lead people.
Yeah.
I don't really want to be a leader. So you moved out of that and you went and actually put everything on the line. You were personally guaranteeing
Mhm.
loans for your startups. Um,
Which, by the way, the time to do personal guarantees, if anybody's ever thinking about it, I would say don't do it. But if you are going to do it when you have no net worth.
yeah.
That's the time to do it, right? Because the difference between zero and -0 is the same, right? It's like if you're bankrupt, you don't get more. So now you have to make sure you can get underwritten and things like that. But I basically put all the money I had, which was not that much, but everything I had
You
into.
were all in.
I was all in.
Yeah. And what was that like leaving a big organization where you actually were a leader of people? Maybe it wasn't leading in how you wanted, or you actually want to do sounded like you want to do more of the analytical work than this kind of maybe relationship cultivation and bringing in the business.
Yeah.
But when you're a startup, you don't really have very many people reporting
Right.
to you either. And so there's something deeper than just I want to lead. You want to just
I wanted to
you want to solve
build.
problems. You want to
Yeah.
build something.
Yeah. I think it was. I mean, I want to. I mean, it's interesting because I went into banking after business school, running away from leadership. Right, I was like, I'm done with. It was like I had been in leadership positions for for the entire time in the army, but in like sort of troop leadership positions for a fairly long time. So basically, my entire time as a second lieutenant and as a first lieutenant until I made captain, which is not like super rare, but a little rare. So for 2.5 years, I was leading platoons or companies ranging from 30 to 150 soldiers, and just dealing with all the stuff, right? Like all the people stuff, like Joe is at jail right now for drunk driving. It's 2 a.m. You got to go pick him up, Lieutenant, right? Like you got to go get him, like that sort of stuff. And I was like, I don't want to deal with this, right? I want to like banking sounds like you're in an office, at the most you're managing one or two analysts and it's all deal, you have deal teams. They're not like you're not like they're reports for a project, but not like you gotta like own the results of their performance for, years. Um, and then I realized I missed some of that, right? I missed developing people. And then to your point, I also missed, like, again, in the army, you can say, well, you weren't really building something, but actually, I would, and you didn't say that, but I think some would say that, right? So I would disagree because, I remember one platoon I took over. It was the second platoon I took over. So I was in a platoon leader position for my first 10 months, and then my company commander switched me to a different platoon because it was kind of a, in business sense, we would say it needed a turnaround,
Mhm.
right? And so, I had to completely change the culture, and you don't have the tools at your disposal in the army that you have in the private sector, meaning you can't fire anybody, like you're stuck with who you got. You can't willy-nilly promote them either, right? There's a whole process and time and tenure and things like that. There's no idea of bonuses. You don't, so you have basically no financial levers, and you have no sort of like, you have no hatchet that you can sort of swing to sort of completely change. So you have to use a lot of different leadership tools and techniques to change culture, to sort of turn around an organization. I really like that. Again, I thought I didn't coming out of the army because I was like, you just do enough of it, you get burnt out. But I missed that after a couple of years.
Yeah.
I think that was probably one of the key things. So the last thing was the jump was a lot of it was, I mean, a lot of it was just, okay, I have an itch that I think that I need to scratch, right? And it's this itch of, I want to try starting something. And, I had, when I left banking, when I left Morgan Stanley, my oldest son, who's 18 now, was one, right? And my wife and I at the time, we wanted to have more kids, and we kind of wanted to get out of Chicago, which is where we were living at the time, and get back to Colorado just because we loved it here. Um, but it was, I mean, I went from a certain sort of total income level, and we were dual income. So then we moved here, and she stopped working because she was pregnant with number two quickly thereafter. Uh, and my total compensation, besides the fact that I put all the money we had and savings into this business and signed these debt guarantees, was cut by, I mean, I cut it myself, but it was 70% less, right? It was 30% of my total compensation. So like in the 12 months after I left Morgan Stanley, and even for the next 2 or 3 years, my total compensation, I think actually the next 2.5 years, my total compensation was equal to my last year at Morgan Stanley for almost 3 years, right? Um, Personally, not the family. I mean, if you take the family, it was actually even lower. And so I was like, geez, why did you do that? It was like, well, now's the time to do it, right? People are always like, that's a big risk. Like, why were we willing to take that? We had a family to support, things like that. And my risk tolerance, or at least my risk calculus, was more of, well, one, nobody's shooting at me, and there's no like, IEDs to worry about. So that calibrates your risk a little bit. And then two was, well, it's actually more risky for me to do it. People think it's more risky to do it when maybe 10, 15 years later. At least in my opinion, I thought it'd be, um, like, or less risky to do it later, right? I've got savings. In my opinion, I was like, that's going to be more risky,
Yeah.
right? Because the opportunity and the time to rebuild career or whatever, if it's failure, I always operated with like, well, if this thing fails, then what, right? Then I'm bankrupt, but that's okay because there was not that much to start with. I need to go find a job, but I felt confident that I could do that with education background, the experience background I had, and even a failed sort of experience in healthcare might be valuable to a hospital employer or to
Right.
a private equity firm or whatever, right? And I just sort of was like, I'm willing to bet on that, and I figured it would, if it did fail, it would fail within 3 years,
Mhm.
right? My fear was always, what if this thing drags on for a decade, right? It's sort of an average. That to me was the bigger fear, but I thought I could extricate myself from that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, so it's, I hear that you're a leader, you had felt the call to leadership,
Hmm.
join the military,
Yeah.
leader of men, call to build, call to create something. These are commonalities that the
Yeah,
audience
a
is
lot of,
listening to, saying like,
yeah.
yeah, call a willingness to sacrifice, to put a lot on
I
the
mean,
line.
you put it in these like, I try not, in fact, I remember there was another podcast that I did with one of your former partners a long time ago, and he made a comment. He was like, it's like all your sort of career choices have been oriented around service,
Mhm.
and like, and I was like, no, I don't think that at all. And even the things you're saying, like, okay, I guess those are true, but I don't think about it that way. Like, those are very, maybe grandiose isn't exactly the right word, but they're very like, they're positive. I don't look at myself in the mirror and think I'm like a not like a negative person. I do think I have, you know, a risk appetite, things like that. But I think about the choices that I made have, in my opinion, from the inside this crazy thing here, are like, well, they're like an analysis of,
Mhm.
well, what am I comfortable living with? And what are the things that drive me, right? Like a big driver of mine is I always very much so wanted to be sort of, for right or wrong, in control of my destiny, right? And you're not really ever going to, there's all kinds of other sort of factors that come into play. But I always wanted to say, if something didn't work out, I'd rather it actually not work out because it was my fault
Mm.
than somebody else's fault,
Mhm.
right? Like I'd rather it be a bad decision that I made than being sort of subject to something else's, the environment or the other, and you can't control for that. I mean, we live in a world of all kinds of other things and all kinds of other decisions and other factors. But I've always tried to, I think that's always been a big driver of mine. So and people might hear that and go, wait a second, but you, you went to West Point and you went into the army. Like you didn't have choice around, like once, the army's going to tell you what to do. And that's true,
Yeah.
but it's actually, in my view, it was, I mean, I went to service academy because I didn't want, I one from a financial needs standpoint, it was like, hey, this is a free ride, right? So I didn't need to then take on debt or, things like that to go to college. So that was a freedom thing for me. That was like in control
Mhm.
because I'm gonna be out of college. The other thing was I I I didn't know exactly what I wanted to be when I grew up,
Yep.
like a lot of, 18-year-olds. And we mentioned earlier, I'm trying to push my oldest son to take a gap year between high school, he's graduating, and college, and do some things with, in Asia or in Europe. He speaks Mandarin, things like that. Um, and I was talking to my mom about this, and she was like, "Well, you didn't do a gap year." I'm like, "Well, not technically in the way that I'm describing it, right? A year between high school and college, but I'd feel like I did like a gap decade, right? It was like I went to a service academy because, like, I don't know what I want to do, so I'll go into the military. That'll give me a bunch of skills, and I'll
Mhm.
learn a bunch of things in order to then be better positioned to sort of know. And then I went to business school, same things, right? So 11 years after I graduated high school, I was like, okay, maybe I want to go into this finance world. And then after 2 years, I go, no, I don't really want to do that, right? I still didn't really know.
Mhm.
But it was always, I go, these sort of attributes are, in my mind, they've always been in service of just be true to yourself and sort of understand, if you fast forward your life 60 years, 70 years, um, not right now, but when you're 20, and you say, well, if I'm there, with my grandkids or whatever, I'm on my deathbed, I'm in my 90s or something like that, hopefully. Um, what are the things that if I look back on, I say, gosh, I even, if I thought about it and I didn't do it, like, why didn't I do it? And if you can't really answer that, then maybe you should go do it.
Mm.
That was always like a driver.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. It feels like, I mean, I hear a lot of, these are buzzwords, but, high agency,
Hmm.
desire for freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of maybe an unconventional view of risk, or maybe it's more conventional among entrepreneurs,
I
but
think it is. I
conventional.
think it is a bit unconventional. At least it doesn't feel that way to me, but that's because it's my own view. but
Yeah.
I think I have enough awareness now of everybody else's sort of viewpoints that, yeah, it was probably a little unconventional.
Yeah.
The risk reward calculus was different for me than for other folks.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as a positive or a negative, just different.
Just
Right.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've felt that oftentimes we overemphasize risk
Hmm.
and underemphasize opportunity
Yeah.
oftentimes, and so that kind of fear-based decision making paralyzes a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, how have you, do you have anything that you share with the audience that'd be helpful in understanding fear management? I think
Hmm.
about, I've never served in the military,
Hmm.
but I am aware that a number of the top leaders of executives, leaders of corporations, and entrepreneurs have had that refining experience in a lot of
Hmm.
ways. That test with
Yeah.
being in the military, which doesn't really compare to a lot of the other things that we talk about sports,
Right.
but that's like kind of at the extreme end
Hmm.
of the pressure that a human would, could be responsible for feeling.
Yeah.
And so do you recommend that as a path for an entrepreneur? Or are there lessons that you developed while you were leading in the military that others could develop, external to the military?
Mhm.
For those who are thinking about their next step and
Yeah.
they're not sure if they're an entrepreneur yet, but they have this call to build, high
Mhm.
agency, they want to have impact, they want their freedom,
Yeah.
you know, what's a path? Your son's taking a gap year.
Maybe if I
Is
if I can get him there.
is the military an interesting path?
He
For
doesn't
an
want that,
entrepreneur?
but yeah, I think I think the military is. I mean, there's a um, there's a book called Startup Nation,
Hmm.
which is about entrepreneurship in Israel, and they tie a lot of parallels to the reason that Israel is such a entrepreneurial economy. Um, it really is, right? Just on a per capita basis, and sort of the innovation that happens there is pretty remarkable. Um, a lot of that is tied to the mandatory service in the military, right? Every citizen in Israel serves for at least a year or two in the military. So I think that there's merit to the idea that the military helps imbue you with some skills and points of view, but you have to. It has to be those seeds have to be planted into fertile ground for it. So what I wouldn't do is say, hey, like if you have a drive to be an entrepreneur, I would be like, oh, go do a pit stop in the military, right? Like I don't think that that's the path. Like you're not going to learn things necessarily from the military, but I do think that if you're coming out of the military and you have this sort of entrepreneurial pull, right? Then you should not underestimate the impact that your training and experience in the military has had,
Yeah.
right? Um, one thing, so back to the question on the fear management. Well, there's maybe two things. One is, so I actually had a. This is not about the military specifically, but the story comes from my time in the military. So I had a battalion commander who was an incredibly influential leader and mentor to me. And for those listening, a battalion, depending on the type of unit, is anywhere from like 800 to 1,400 soldiers, usually made up of 4 to 6 companies, and each company has 3 to 4 platoons. So you can do the math from that, right? So my battalion commander at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Gus Perna, was just a really tremendous leader, really, really tough. I mean, like he scared everybody. Like he was just a scary guy. But he would do things um like for all the officers in the battalion, we had I can't remember if it was once a quarter or every 6 months. I think it was once a quarter. We had a book club. It wasn't called that. It was just like, hey, you got to read this book, and then we're gonna get together for 3 hours on Tuesday morning. We're gonna talk about it, and I'm gonna drill you on this sort of stuff. And I remember the very first book that we read was Who Moved My Cheese, um, and um, I had a book club at Sondermind. When by the time we were I mean, it was probably like right after the seed round, actually. So right after you guys invested, I think is when I started it. So August of 2018, and we would do it every quarter. And the whole company it was mandatory, right? And then we would read the same book, and we would, then go to dinner somewhere all together um, and talk about it. And I'll talk about the reason why I did that in a second when I finish this story, if it's interesting.
Sure.
Um, the reason I'm tying it together is one of the books that we read a couple of years into the book club for Sondermind was Who Moved My Cheese, because it's still relevant today. So
Hmm.
I think what it frames is like, if you weren't afraid, like if you didn't have fear, what would you do?
Right.
Right. I think that's just a good framing, right? Like doesn't because you can't ignore the emotion, right? So it's not to say that you should, just because you're afraid of it, you should sort of do it as a means to conquer it. No, that's not true either. It's like it's an emotion. It's a feeling, right? And so feelings can cloud your judgment,
Mm.
and they're good data points too. So it's like it's an and. You should sort of remove your feelings when making decisions, and you should take into account your feelings. Why am I scared about this? Right? If I didn't have any fear, hypothetically, let's say I wasn't, for whatever reason, I'm a crazy person. I would, who's the guy who clowned Capitan?
Alatonal.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
right. Like what they did, like MRIs, and they're like he has some part of his brain that's lower functioning in terms of the fear mechanism, right? And it's like that allows him to free climb this ridiculous, just like huge things, right? Like it's it's that's just a different makeup, right? So you go, okay, if I'm like him, and I wasn't afraid, what would I do? You know, if I wasn't afraid of climbing El Capitan, I still wouldn't climb it because I'm not all that interested in it, and I don't think I'll get any value out of it, right? Um,
You're not interested in doing the preparation for
yeah, I'm
it.
not. It's not something I'm interested in, right? So, but I think it's a good framing. Um, so that's one thing I would say is ask yourself, like, if I wasn't afraid of doing this, what would I do? And I don't know that I learned. Like I mentioned this book with Colonel Perna, which, just to finish like, he was an excellent leader in so many ways. He ended up, and the Army rewarded him for it, meaning like he progressed very well, and he retired not too long ago, a couple of years ago, after 40 years service. He retired as a 4-star general, which is very, very rare. And if anybody hears that name, here's General Perna. Why would I hear that name? He was his last position was a presidential appointee as 4-star general and COO of Operation Warp Speed, which was that distribution of all the COVID vaccine,
Yeah.
right, in 2021. So he led all of that under President Biden. And so anyway, so I think there were just some things that you like. There's a lot of things in the military you learn. So there's that book, wasn't like a military teaching, it was from him, but I think it was interesting for me to sort of think about, okay, if I'm not afraid, what's the decision I would make? And then the other is, and again, I think it's just my own personal makeup. So unlike Alex
Honnold.
Honnold,
Yeah.
I have that, whatever it is, amygdala or something like that, right?
You have a fear response.
I have a fear response, right? So, but there is probably something in me, and I've, other friends and people who know me pretty well, and I've read about I've read about like Stoicism, where I think in retrospect, I'm probably like, so they said, you're like a natural Stoic, right? So, um, and I recognize that now, where it used to be 20 years ago, I would think, why are people worrying about things that they can't control? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you just worry about the things you can control, right? And it's like, well, no, most people do worry about the things they can't control, right? And so as I, again, a couple of decades later, I started reading more Stoicism, and I read it and I was like, this is all like, duh. Like, it was like, you read these things. So I think that's the other piece, is that with that mindset, or with that makeup that I have just naturally, I'm not saying people should develop it one way or the other, it's just me. Um, it always put me in a frame of mind that, in fact, like I said, the agency piece, like I want to have control over the things that are happening to me, because those are the things that I will ultimately spend my time thinking about and engaging in, and the things that I have less control over, I don't worry about as much.
Yeah.
It's just going to happen. And then I think that plays into the fear piece, right? Because then you go, well, if I can't control, so like when I was in Iraq, we'd have these like mortar attacks in the middle of the night. The surgeons and people like that would be sort of like outside the areas. They'd be lobbing mortars, right? And they're just random. I mean, they're not accurate devices. They land, but then they blow up, right? They kill people. And so we'd have these mortar attacks. Like this, thing goes off, and it wakes you up, and you gotta, throw on your vests and run into like the ditch you dug or whatever. Not like, it wasn't like every single night, but probably a couple nights a week, right? For a while, like for months and months. And when I came back, my wife and friends were like, "Oh wow, like weren't you just scared all the time?" I'm like, no. Like, they're like, "Well, how?" Like, I'm not like, it's just, like, I can't control that at all. I didn't worry about that. Like, what am I gonna do? Walk around in fear all day that a mortar might land on my head? If it does, it does. There's literally nothing I can do to control that
Yeah.
at all. IEDs, roadside bombs, can't control those either, but you can influence them, right? So I would worry about that more. I made sure to prep my unit on these convoys really, really well. I would drill into the, 'cause, you're there for a year, nothing happens, or whatever, 6 months, and people get lazy. They're not scanning. They don't have the rifles pointed out the vehicle. They're not sort of like paying attention as much as they were on the first week. It's just like anything else. You get sort of used to it. And I would light a fire to make sure, because, that's what I can control. I can control their behavior. I can control the thing, we had a couple near misses and things like that, but, I can say, well, I did everything I could do.
Yeah.
And at the end, if it hits me, then I'm not going to worry about it because I did everything I can do. Right.
I think that's super powerful, and what a great, I guess, snapshot into the mind of a CEO and leader.
Yeah.
It's like, what can I control and what can't I
That's right.
control?
As a CEO and definitely as an entrepreneur,
Mhm.
it's like you got to focus on what you can control and what you can't. Right. And complaining about it doesn't change it. Right. I mean, sometimes you just need an event. That's okay. Right.
Yeah,
But you got to focus on like, what are you going to do about it?
yeah, yeah. A couple of the,
Can I interject there?
mhm.
Are there lessons maybe that you could reflect on Sondermind's history, where you purposeful moments where you chose to I can control that.
Mm-hmm.
I can't control that. Like, do you have any examples of that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me, well, let's go straight to Sondermind
Okay.
here. Let's dig into Sondermind a little bit.
Yeah.
But the only other, kind of reflection on a couple of things that you raised here, one was Alex Honnold, where when he has different brain chemistry, and maybe there's a certain element of that in
Mhm.
founders and entrepreneurs. But I've also heard him describe, his kind of surprise when people talk about how I could never do that, or how can you take on so much risk? How can you like put that to the side when there is a real risk that that he's facing, a relative risk?
Yeah.
And for him, it's like I people don't understand how much I've trained for this. I've
Yeah.
done every single one of these moves so many times over and over. It's been my life obsession
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
years and years.
As a little kid.
Yeah, and I take just meticulous notes, and so it's also a story of just obsessive preparation.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of that, I want this thread to continue into, talk a little bit more about Sondermind,
Yeah.
because we heard some of the backstory around how you got to this point, the
Yeah. Yeah.
experience, and the preparation.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times we hear the story of the college dropout who goes and
Mhm.
starts his software business,
Mm-hmm.
but you were out leading soldiers for a period of time, and you were doing banking, and you put your house on the line for a period of time to become the entrepreneur. And so I think that you had the preparation. You talk about you take the risks early, but you
Mhm.
also didn't take them too early. You went
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
got that preparation. So
Yeah.
I note that when the more prepared someone is, the more they can assess what they should be afraid of or not, or
That's
what
right.
the risks are, or what they can control, what they
Yep.
can't. And so I feel like you were able to apply stoicism in part because of your experience that you
For
had
sure.
gained.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thought that comes to mind also, and it's interesting that you mentioned "Who Moved My Cheese," because I hadn't thought of that book in years, but I think it was this morning, it popped into my head because I was thinking about, like, how do we talk about AI and the changing
Yeah.
industries, and I'm like, "Oh, it's Who Moved My Cheese" all over again.
Yeah.
That we all think that we figured out, like, "Okay, I've got my model, I've got my business, I'm making money, like, this is gonna continue forever.
Yeah.
This is great." Like,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
figuring out, and then all of a sudden it's like, something changed.
Everything changed. Yeah.
And so if your expectation is like, I'm never gonna arrive at a point where like I've got everything set up and it's just, humming, that doesn't really ever happen, because the cheese will always move because of
Always.
competition and changing technologies and
Yeah.
trends. And so I guess let's spend the second half of this
Yeah.
conversation really talking about Sondermind and your
Yeah.
experience building this unicorn here in Colorado.
Yep.
When you went out to raise the seed round, you had already had a couple of startups. You had preparation. You knew what you wanted to do.
Mhm.
This wasn't like a, kind of a passing fancy to go, solve this problem, address
Right.
this problem. I've heard you talk about your care for the mental health of soldiers,
Mhm.
and this was an inspiring thing for you. So here you are. I'm going to go make a difference in mental
Yeah.
health care in
Yep.
this country. And so walk us forward from
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I gave the background on sort of next oncology or Nova Cancer and Safe Image MD. These, the service and the technology side, and somebody said, "Well, why you're like a serial entrepreneur, right?" And it's like, well, I said this the other day. So, well, they were all actually all these things were kind of overlapped, right? Like I was doing Safe Image while running Next Oncology. I was doing that on the side, and then I started thinking about the problem for Sondermind, also while doing both of those. And the problem emanated from my own search for a therapist. I had 3 kids in 3.5 years. I was running these 2 companies, stressful, all that sort of stuff. And I knew healthcare. I was dealing with insurance companies all the time, contracting with them, dealing with providers. I was in healthcare deep, right? I knew the Parity Act had been passed in 2009, which made at par mental health benefits with all physical health benefits. I was like, okay, so this is now a covered benefit on my insurance plan. And I was like, I'm going to go find a therapist to deal with some things that I need to deal with. And it was nearly impossible, right? It took months and months to find somebody who even took my insurance or had availability. Um, when I finally did, because I'm just dog with a bone, persistent, like I could have paid out of pocket, but I was like, no, damn it, I'm using my insurance because I'm paying for this as the employer and the employee, right? Like I'm going to use these benefits. And uh, when I finally found somebody, the clinical care was good, but I just was sort of struck by how poor the consumer experience was, right? Like we went into this little dingy basement office and there's no windows because that's all the therapist can afford. So that's all the stuff on the consumer or the patient or the client, as we call them in Sondermind, side of the fence. And so I was looking, trying to see, well, there must have been solved. Maybe this is a thing in Colorado. Maybe that's, this exists in other markets. Not really. I couldn't really find it. So I was digging into that and I was paying attention to what to me was such an obvious, like the tsunami. This is like 2012, 2013. It was like, we're going to get hit with this tsunami of mental health need. It's coming. It was just like one of my earliest leaders, he became my COO, was a friend of mine. He was working for a big healthcare company here in town called DaVita. And I remember talking to him and we were friends and he was like, he said, he recalls this and tells me, you sounded a little bit like a crazy person. You were like, it's going to just be this huge thing. We got to address it. And he was like, I don't see it, And so that was one thing. And then the other thing was the whole provider problem, the therapist and the psychologist problem. And I saw that firsthand because my younger sister's a therapist. So she went to private practice and struggled with all these things, how to get clients, how to deal with office-based stuff, how to, administrative business running type things. There was no real good EHRs, electronic health record systems at the time for therapists. And so I was like, wow. And I talked to her, I talked to a bunch of her colleagues. So probably like 2013 to 2014, I think I spoke. My cousin in Florida is a clinical psychologist as well. So I had that benefit. So I had these family members who could connect with people in the space. And I'd probably talk to 30 or 40 different providers, basically doing user research and trying to understand their problem. Because I recognized that the way to solve the problem that I faced as a patient or as a consumer was going to be through the provider.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the genesis. And so when I met my co-founder as part of that, himself a therapist, and he had a private practice, and he had some office space and a business around sort of a co-working, which I was also interested. I have a real estate license that I got when I was in the Army in Colorado, so I still have an active Colorado real estate license. I've always been interested in real estate. I said, okay, well, there's this opportunity for sort of like you mentioned the Uber, for like a we work for a therapist kind of thing, right? And he was sort of doing some of that. And I said, well, that could be a way to bring these therapists together and we can build technology around that. And then by doing that, we can enable sort of better care because these therapists in private practice, they want to be in private practice. They're not trying to join back into a W-2 group setting most of the time. Like that's actually where they're often coming from. And by doing that, we can then contract with the insurance plans and we can have, this comprehensive care model where we have the full tech stack of how they do clinical notes, treatment planning, how we get them matched to the right provider. Because we'll have objective information around, hey, this provider, even though they say they do these 7 things, they treat these different issues, they're actually really good at these 2.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really good at those 2 for these 3 demographics, right? Because we could see the data around that if we built our own tool. So, and that could allow for better matching and that could allow for better care. And it was always oriented to where how do we ultimately drive better clinical quality and better outcomes in the space that I thought was A, very fragmented. So it was like, how can you defragment the space? But B, pretty subjective in terms of how we measure care and quality,
Mm-hmm.
and move into more of an objective setting. So that was the vision. And, I'll call it 2014 to 2016 was mostly about building this sort of footprint of the physical space to bring these therapists together in this sort of, call it a co-working, but it was more of like a flexible space situation while starting to build some of the technology. So even it was in early 2016 was when we started to build our EHR platform, our electronic health record platform. So my co-founder for Safe Image MD became my first CTO for Sondermind, and he was the CTO from the 3 of it. Well, and one of my other employees from my general manager from Next Oncology. By that point, I had sold that business in 2015. A few months later, she said, I can't work at this with these, with the new buyers anymore. Can you connect me with some people who might be looking for something? I said, oh, I might have something for you. She's like, great. I'd love to work. We'd worked together for 6 years. And so, I kind of like brought her in from one company. I brought Sid in, my CTO from the, my co-founder from the other company, and that we sold that in 2016. And so, and then Sean, my co-founder, again, I've been working on this at this point for 2 years. So that was like the 4-person team in 2016 and started building around that. And by, early 2017, started raising a little bit of like angel money, right? I at this point, I put in a reasonable amount of my capital, to fund it. And obviously Sean and I had all sweat equity. We weren't really paying ourselves anything. And, and was starting to talk to VCs. In fact, that's when I talked to Gavin, was at my, it was our 10-year reunion. It was in 2017 in the spring for business school. And,
Shout out to Kellogg.
yeah,
It was-
Kellogg MBA, 07. And we met up at, one of these, things, and Nathan Etherly, another Kickstart former founder and classmate from business school and Service Academy grad himself, Air Force Academy grad. He said, how well do you know Gavin? I said, oh, kind of. He's like, all this stuff you're doing with Sondermind, like he'd be interested in this. And we were talking, and he was like, oh yeah, keep me in touch. And I was like, I'm starting to talk, and at this point, it still had this real estate piece to it. It had, it was healthcare service. We were treating patients with mental health services. It had a technology component. And to top it all off, to make it literally the most VC unfriendly business, it was a franchisor.
Mhm.
So like a lot of the locations were franchised, right? Because that's a good way to bring in capital to scale, right? Is franchising. But I mean, VCs don't really invest in franchising businesses, and at the time, VCs were definitely not doing a lot of healthcare service investing, and definitely not behavioral health. They're like, what is this industry? And so fast forward, another 6 months, back to the question around some struggles. It was really difficult. It was, I ended up splitting the company into two. We started putting into motion basically a spinoff where we split Sondermind into two companies. We started the process in summer of 2017, and by basically end of September 2017, separated it into two companies. So those angel investors who had come in to that pre-split company got shares in Sondermind Inc., which was the split company, and then Sondermind Wellness Centers, which is now called Humanly. And then we said, okay, and I focused all my attention then on Sondermind Inc., and Sean, my co-founder, focused all his attention on Humanly, which again wasn't named that until about a year later. And so that separation, meaning we separated the real estate piece and we separated the franchising piece, I think made us a little more palatable. I won't even say attractive, but palatable to institutional investors of venture capital. But one of the things people are surprised about when I talk to early founders who are struggling, fundraising is hard, right? Is I had I think I used first just a Google Sheet, right? And then I upgraded to Streak, right? Which was pretty new at the time. It was like, it's a plug-in CRM for Gmail. I think I had, 170 investor meetings for my actual seed round, right? Not for so new investor meetings. I mean, like unique investors. So, times however many when they go to second and third and fourth meeting. 170. Now, not all were institutional investors. Some were family offices. Some were, and large angels and things like that. 170.
It's a lot.
And guess how many term sheets I got? Just the one, right? And the question that is often asked, like, what were some of like the real hard decisions? I mean, it was like we were perpetually running out of money, right? I mean, it was like while I was fundraising for that, I was bringing in, $50K checks as whenever I could every month or two from somewhere, just to keep the lights on, basically, just to pay the 7 employees that I had, right? Nobody made 6 figures, literally. Like, there was nobody who was making $100,000 in the company, and these are all pretty experienced people, of the 7 of us. And it was like late 2017. Brandon, who became my COO, the person who was, he had just he came in and took no money for the first 2 months, no salary. And then his first paycheck was December 25th, 2017, December 15th. And then I think on December 20th, I said, hey, I'm going to talk to you first about this, but I'm going to talk to the whole company, all 7 of us, about the need to do a salary deferral. Like, I'm going to ask for volunteers to basically reduce your salary as much as possible so that we can not run out of money. I think I'll be able to raise this round in the next, 3 or 4 months. And I think I maybe can drum some more, 25K checks here and there. And we did, and most people reduced their salary down by, 70, 80%, and people really banded together. But that was incredibly difficult, obviously, to do, and to ask people to do. And everybody got their money back, and everybody got extra shares for it. And it all worked out. But, it was not easy, right? It was like,
And this was all
many times.
bootstrapping with some angel capital, your own
Right.
capital, some angel
Yeah.
checks here and there.
Yeah.
And then you raised kind of the proper seed round
Yeah.
in 2018.
2018, yeah.
Yeah.
And Kickstarters, but I mean, it was really, I think, and I tell founders this, and this is not meant to be I mean, this isn't an advertisement, right? Like this, this podcast isn't like, oh, like let's advertise Kickstarter. I am speaking from the heart, and I do in private settings. And anybody who's listening to this, who's met me and had the conversation, I say it right, which is as far as what seed investors promise, institutional seed investors promise, um, both from my own experience, but also in talking to lots of peers, right? I mean, hundreds of other CEOs and founders who are also in, series, C, D, E, IPO'd, whatever. When I talk about, how was your experience with your early investors, with your first check in, first institutional check? It's a mixed bag,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what I can definitively say is that everything that you all said, right? That, the partners at Kickstart said they would do, you did, right? Like, we will be there to support you when times get tough. We will follow on, you know, in as many rounds as we can. I mean, you guys followed on in every single round. You guys followed on in the Series C, 150 million fundraise round, right? Like that's most seed round. Those seed rounds don't do that at all, right?
Yeah.
And even, I mean, one of the stories that doesn't get told very often, and when we raised our Series B, I think this. I'm sure it was a pardon decision at some point. Again, we didn't work together during that time directly, but we raised our, we signed our term sheet for our Series B in January 2020. Great investor, General Catalyst leading the round, F Prime coming in, all of our other institutional investors coming in as well. We were growing really well. We had grown, I think 8x year over year at that point. And we were going to close the round in late February 2020. Like that was and General Catalyst said, we would really like for you. And they put the pressure on hard. And I kept saying no. And finally they pulled out the big guns. Like, I really need you to do this. They wanted to put their investment in Sondermind into the very first, basically be the first investment from their fund to 10, which they were raising their fund 10, and they were going to close that at the end of March.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, no, this is all allocated for fund 9. I'd rather just get the money in. We're growing well. We have a working capital. Like, part of when our growth goes, like we had really good growth. And so part of the financing is to fund our working capital, right? Because we pay our therapists fairly much, like basically instantaneously, right? Or within a week, depending on sort of where it lines up, but generally within like from 0 to 7 or 8 days after they've completed a session. But because we're working with insurance and Medicare and things like that, we don't get paid until, 30, 60 days later,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you're growing, you run out of money because you're having the working capital. So we were fine with it. And then when I go, okay, fine. I don't really want to wait to the end of March because there's this virus, seems like, is kind of in Asia. It might have gone into Europe, and I don't know, like it's February. And they said, no, it'll be fine. I said, okay, like twist them arm. And I said, okay, let's do this. And 2 weeks later, we all know the story, right? Like, the world sort of shuts down. We had a completely we were doing pretty much everything in person. We'd already been building all the technology for video care. We'd already launched our text messaging platform for therapy. But we pulled up our launch date by 2.5 months to launch our video platform because we had, thousands of therapists at this point who were delivering care, and they wouldn't be able to deliver care. And that's their livelihood, and also the care needed by their patients, by their clients, if we didn't launch our video piece. So we did all that, in the sort of first 2-3 weeks of March, and got that going. And all of a sudden we're like, and growth was just tremendous during the whole time. And we're like, it's gonna be really tight. Like, if General Catalyst doesn't close their fund, because all of these funds were not getting, people were like, everything was shutting down, right? Like it was just like
Yeah.
panic, right? Like, people were like, oh no, we're not closing funds. Like, VCs were pulling term sheets all over the place. And I was like, well, every day I'm on the phone with them saying, and they're like, no, we're going to close it. It's all good. We've got our anchor LPs, all this other stuff, but you never know.
Mm-hmm.
And so it got really, really tight at the end of the month. And I didn't want to pull on the bank line that we had set up because it would have triggered a bunch of warrant issuance, which would have been just dilutive capital that was unnecessary because we were getting the money in, right? It was literally like a matter of days. And I came to, Kurt was the partner that I was working with and on the board. And I said, here's the deal. Like, can we just need like a bridge? Literally, it might even be a week or two, at most 30 days of, 500,000 just to make sure that we can pay our therapists and stuff like that in case. And I don't want to pull on this bank line. And he said, yeah, and then came back, and you guys, what you could have done was been, not like predatory. You can be like, oh, like let's get some, interest rate that's higher than normal, and let's maybe have some warrants that are issued around it. And there was none of that. It wasn't even asked, right? It was like the offer was, yeah, of course we'll do this. And we'll do this, at a 5% annual rate or something like that, and you pay it back. So that all worked out, paid the money back to you within 30 days. You made whatever, like $1,000 on that or something, whatever the de minimis interest was for that period of time. But completely supportive of the company, right? And so I think that's like, you should be, and Gavin and the rest of the partners should be really proud of the culture that you've created and held yourself to in terms of supporting founders, particularly when the times are tough, and not necessarily like, you could always make the argument, well, we have to do the right thing for our LPs and this, that, and the other, and you go, no, we're founder first, right? So I always appreciate
Thanks,
that.
Mark. Yeah, we'd love for that to be the story for every interaction that we have,
Yeah.
and it is. There are times where we can't make, the investment that we would love to make.
Yeah, I know.
For us, it always felt very easy in Sondermind because
Mhm.
of how well the company was run. But a big part of what we've tried to build at Kickstart is certainly a reputation for being supportive to entrepreneurs in the
Mhm.
good times and the bad.
Yeah.
And, investing out of Fund 6 right now, we know what it takes in order to be a lead investor.
Mhm.
And that means that as a seed investor, you reserve capital and we follow on into multiple rounds. So this
Yeah.
was a Fund 4 initial investment, and we wrote multiple checks out of Fund 4. We wrote a check out of Fund 5 and out of our co-investment vehicle.
Yep.
And so, we're honored to be investors, and thank you for the kind words. You'd love to know a little bit more about, let's talk, what it was like. It was hard to raise money. You felt like you got, the support you needed from your early investors. You grew your business tremendously. It benefited from this, COVID tailwind where everybody was now remote. People still needed therapy more than ever.
Yeah.
And so we saw this like 10x valuation increase over that round that you just described.
Yeah.
A year later, you were raising your kind of $1 billion valuation, $150 million round. And, fast forward to today, that was the last capital that you took.
Right. Yeah. 5 years ago.
Yeah, 5 years ago. So congratulations for being able to manage your business where that could be the last check that you took during that
Yeah.
time. And market has certainly shifted quite a bit since then. But I'd love to know a little bit more about, there are a couple of topics I want to press on. One is just around taking money at high valuations, and I know you have thoughts on that
Yeah.
entrepreneurs could benefit from. So let's start with that.
Yeah.
You were just it's going crazy. You're one of the hottest mental health startups in the country. Everybody wants to invest in your business. 10x. It's like you're turning money down. So what's happened since then? And is there anything you would, what are some of the lessons from those?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, the 2022, but mostly 2021 timeframe was, for all businesses, was just crazy, right? I mean, zero interest rates from the Fed, basically, 0% interest rate. You have just this mania around funding, all kinds of early stage and medium stage businesses, venture backed businesses, all kinds of investors getting into it, right? From, the like hedge funds are going into early stage investing and investing in seeds. I mean, you guys probably you got to deal with it like crazy, right? All these you're like, wait a second, who are these investors that are coming from Wall Street that are investing in pre-revenue companies?
They never
right?
cared before.
They never cared before, and they don't care again, right? But there was a period of time. So I do talk about this with other founders a reasonable amount. This being, there's a high degree of valuation sensitivity and dilution sensitivity, I think, particularly in the early rounds of funding. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be; it's natural, but to give even more context, right? Like, yes, the valuation 10x, the business also, the business about 8x, so revenue 8x from Series B to Series C. But if we go all the way back and go, okay, like my seed round, the one you guys invested in initially, from seed to Series A, we about 7x revenue in a year. And I raised the next round from the seed to the A. And our seed was a single digit post money valuation, right? It was like 7.5 million post money or something like that, 7.8 maybe. On like 2.5 million. So like a $5 million pre-money valuation. And we were revenue, we had, an experienced founder, and we'd been around for a couple of years and good traction, all this other stuff. Product was, built in a reasonable sense. Um, and so that's a reasonable amount of dilution. You go, that's not immaterial. Um, and fast forward a year later, and it was, basically on a pre-money basis, you know, a little less than 2.5x increase, even though we had 7x revenue, right? And then a year later from there, there's about a 5x valuation increase for the Series B, and we had about 8x revenue year over year. And then a year later, we had about 8x revenue again, and as you said, it was about a 10x valuation increase. So the valuation increases that we were having were somewhat actually in line with our revenue increases, right? Just on a multiple basis. And I remember with Series B, and certainly with the seed and the A, I was very much optimizing for the right partner. And with the seed, I was just optimizing for getting money, right? It was like when you have one option, you like
Take
you take it, right?
More or less.
But I was it's better to be lucky than good. So I was lucky that I had such a great option with Kickstart. For my Series A, I was I had basically a lead lined up, but it wasn't an institution. It was a really, really valuable, like sort of individual strategic investor who ended up getting on the board and has become a very good friend. And he's now running for governor of Maine. And he founded a company called Athena Health.
Do you want to give him a shout out for his
Jonathan Bush? Yeah, it was a great. I mean, he's a great investor, but a better operator and board member. And he runs a company called Zeus, as well as he's running for governor right now. And so I had him sort of lined up as sort of like the lead, but he's not an institutional. So then had this tremendous firm in Nashville, FCA Venture Partners, who came in to lead the round, and then you guys. So it was really like 3 investors, and then some little, on the edges, some people who wanted to take their pro rata, but kept it really small. Like 3 million in our Series A when we were growing that fast, with it's a big TAM. There was appetite, and more than that, I would say there was pressure actually from some other investors, from other VCs, who said, "Look, for us to only put in 1 million to lead this round, it's too small for us. We need to put in 3." And they said, "We'll make your valuation higher so that the dilution's the same." And so when I give the advice I'm about to say, it's not hollow. Like, it's the advice that I took myself, right? Which is, especially in the early days, 2 things. One, the scarcity of capital is not. Everybody thinks of it as like it's a barrier, it's a speed block, right? No. And it can be in some ways, but I'd say in the early days when you're, sub 30-person team, you want that. It forces innovation.
Yeah.
It forces ingenuity, right? It's, if you have too much money, you just go you'll hire the person who's got the experience because you can pay them. You'll do the thing that's the tried and true way because they have the experience. That's why you're hiring them, right? And you'll do that too early, right? So that's one reason. And that's a judgment call. What does too early mean? You can't say seed or A or B is too. It all depends on your business. So there's not like a specific, like, here's what too early means to take less or more capital. I felt like our Series A was too early. I felt like, even though there's a case to be made that we should have raised 6 or 7 or 8 million, which was on the table from some firms, I only raised 3, and we were like out of money. I mean, like, if I hadn't raised it when we raised it, we were gonna maybe have 1 more payroll for the Series A. Same with the seed. We were gonna run out of money. I had to do the deferral, right? But then fast forward to the Series B, and I actually had an immense amount of interest. Again, now we were at a scale. We were nearing 10 million in run rate revenue. We were at a scale in a market that was starting to get more exposure. People were starting to see what I'd seen 6, 7 years ago. They were like, "Oh wow, this mental health thing is a big deal." And we had enough traction. We were early. We were, one of the first sort of, maybe the first sort of our model, the first one out there. There was a couple other companies that were more like employer focused and more tech focused. And so we had I would say, a plethora of term sheets for our Series B. And I remember there were a couple of firms who were trying to play the valuation game again. And in that regard, you could say, okay, I'm raising roughly 25 million. These are real numbers we're talking about right now. The dilution and the amount of capital you're raising matters. And I still said, no, I don't want to overraise. I certainly wasn't optimizing for efficiency of I wasn't like, oh, let's raise a tiny amount. 25 is a lot of money. But I wasn't so valuation sensitive. I actually had a couple of prospective investors who said, what would be the price where we would win this? And I said, you know what? I really like this firm, General Catalyst. I really like the partner or the operating partner who was me coming in, Eric Rosa, because I have a bias toward bringing on prior CEOs onto the board. I just have a, for better or worse, like I have a bias having operators on around the boardroom with me.
Mhm.
And so they were going to do that. And I said, no, I'm just not going to play the game. Don't even tell me. I said, unless it's, 10x what you're going to, what might, and they were like, well, it's not going to be that, And so, but I told a few of them, I said, however, in the Series C, whenever that is, I didn't think it would be a year later, but when I raise my next round after the Series B, maybe 2 or 3 years from now, I am going to optimize for price then.
Mhm.
That's when I'm going to optimize for price. And so now fast forward to the question. I know it's a long-winded answer to get back to
Great backstory.
but I think the backstory matters, right? Because then it's like, okay, I raised this big amount of money. I actually didn't go to market saying was going to raise 150. I went to the market one without need. We had only deployed a third of our Series B capital a year later, so I still had plenty of capital to keep doing the thing. But the market was there, right? And so, what's the adage, like when people are, when they're handing out money, you pass around the hat kind of thing,
Mhm.
right? And as a CEO, particularly later stage now, like, and not like that the company was so late stage, but at least from a funding standpoint, part of your job is to get the right cost of capital, right? So this is where, I wasn't focused on cost of capital for my Series Seed or my A or even my B that much, right? It was like, let's just get the right capital.
Mhm.
But for Series C, my cost of capital, meaning like what's the valuation and how much is this really, diluting and diluting other shareholders? Because now it's not just me, it's other institutional investors, things like that. I got to think I have a job to do the right thing for all my shareholders. And I always had that, but before that it was pretty much me and my co-founder with the shareholders, so I don't regret we went up from 75 to 150. The reason we did was because, we had some investors who said, well, they kind of did the same thing. What's the price that would have us win this round?
Mhm.
And I said, well, this price with this amount of capital. And I made the price higher, but I also made the capital, instead of 75, I made it 150 because I knew I would need more. And then I was really freaked out when they said yes. I proposed the price and I was like, I thought there'd be a negotiation, but there wasn't, because this was the craziness of 2021. It was just like, they didn't say yes on the spot, but a day later they came, yes, that's it. And I was like, what? Wait, what? You said yes? Like, I thought this was a negotiation. That's how negotiations work. Like
I was angry and high.
opening bid, you're gonna come back and it's probably gonna end up being somewhere in the middle, right? So it's like, here's my anchor, and then you're gonna come in with something and there'll be somewhere in the middle we'd land. And I was like, oh my God, I have to go fill the rest of this round. And it ended up being nearly 2x oversubscribed. So it was like crazy. I was just blown away. I remember talking to one of my board members at dinner a week or two before we closed the first closing. We did, like, I think 2 or 3 closings for this. And I was totally freaked out. Not because I was worried about the closing. We had it all lined up. I said to him, I don't know how I'm going to generate a 3 to 5x return in the next 3 to 5 years on this price. And I'm like, am I doing the right thing? And he's a former CEO of a public company, and this wasn't Jonathan, it was another board member. He said to me a couple things. That one, it's not your job to set the valuation. Your job is to get the right cost of capital and properly capitalize the business, and then deploy those resources properly, right?
Mhm.
Use it wisely. And two, in that process, he's like, did you lie about anything? Do you think you can meet your projections? Were you, open and sort of direct and transparent in the diligence and everything throughout all this? I said, absolutely. He said, do you think you can meet your plan over the next 2 to 3 years? I said, yeah, I do. I think I can meet the plan. Right. And where we are today, 5 years later, is we've more than 4x the revenue of the business. We've gone from basically, whatever our EBITDA margin was, a negative 50%, burning crazy amount of capital in that time period, to basically break even to EBITDA positive now, and on a plan for more like, in the 3 to 8% EBITDA range, over $250 million in revenue. In all 50 states. I think we were at that point in time, maybe we were in like 8 states. We've acquired now 4 companies. We just closed another acquisition in February. Acquired 4 companies of very different nature, technology, otherwise. We've built up the technology suite in a huge, huge way. So the company is definitively better. Oh, by the way, we have almost the same employee headcount today as we did 5, maybe not 5, 4 years ago. But I think we had 200 25 when we closed the Series C, and pretty quickly we got to 300. So we have about a little over 300 employees now. So basically all with the same headcount, right? So it's like the company is definitely better, and just to be transparent, we're probably not as much worth as much as our last round, right? Like we're probably underwater. We were very solid in early capital, but
There's what you can control and what you can't.
yeah, it's like I mean we've done. I mean, if multiples had stayed the same, the business would be 4 or 5x better. Be valued 4 or 5x more.
Yeah.
Right. But they didn't stay the same, and so that's the challenge that I think entrepreneurs have in these environments. And I know that there's companies today, particularly in the AI space, that are dealing with this, which is it's when they're really frothy, you go, I'm just gonna take a bunch of money. But when you take that money, you got to clear that hurdle. Like this is preferred equity. It's debt like in that you got to pay, no matter what, you got to pay the money back.
Yeah.
Right. And so the amount of money you bring in, you got to pay that back. And so you have to really think about, okay, that value, you got to pay it back at the valuation, right? Meaning you got to think about, if I sell this company in X years, will I be able to sell it for at least as much as I'm raising, like the price I'm raising at now? If I can't, then I'm just paying that money back right off the top, and that's going to impact my return as a founder, right? And those early investors who bet on me when it was nothing. So be very careful about the quantum of capital you raise in any round. But I think especially in the early rounds, because it's harder, to sort of achieve that if you're raising a big amount of money in the early rounds and a high valuation, you have to cross that hurdle just to raise the next round, right? Not just for an exit. It's like you got to ideally have at least a 2x increase on your valuation from post money to pre money, right? From Series A to Series B, from Series B to Series C, rule of thumb. And so it makes it very difficult to raise around if you can't do that. And it's hard for your other investors to sort of participate and do things. And moreover, from an exit standpoint, you're really, it makes it really difficult for you to return capital to those early employees, to those early investors, to yourself as a founder, when you raise too much at too high a valuation.
Yeah. One question I have through all of this, it was lean times early on, but you were, growing your business 5 to 10x year over year during this period. And then you eventually kind of hit this breakout moment where you were turning money down. You had more than, you could accept. And then we've had this stretch where valuations have shifted. And so when you think about the beginning to where we're at right now, cheese has been moved a little bit.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah.
And I'd say also kind of the requirements of the leader have shifted, where you're product market fit early on, true founder to scaling an organization.
Yeah.
Sometimes we hear these phrases. I think Horowitz from The Hard Thing About Hard Things talks about wartime CEOs, peacetime CEOs.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, have you felt yourself shifting from like, okay, it's wartime, peacetime, or is it always wartime?
No.
And how have things changed with more money? Does that mean like, hey, we've got this valuation we have to grow into, multiples are compressed, like we're on the path? Or is it, hey, we have more resources just to go take market share right now? I mean, I don't know, like maybe it's the wrong framework to even think about it, but it's how has your leadership had to change as you've had more or less resources in the different stages of the business?
Yeah, it's yes and right? It's like all the above. So I think maybe to the extent that there's founders that are listening or watching, CEOs, you hear it all the time, but it just to hammer it home, your job changes. I mean, as a founder CEO, your job is incredibly different, when you're a 10, 15 person company, scrappy, whatever, 15 to 30, 45 person company, 50 to 100 person company. Each of those are, I don't mean like, oh, it changes a little. I mean, like what you should be doing changes materially, I mean, like almost completely differently. Like you have to unlearn things that were the ways you were successful before as a leader, as an entrepreneur, as an operator, in order to be successful in that, for that period of time, for that scale, for that stage. That's irrespective of sort of what's going on in terms of how the external market is, both your industry as well as the funding market or the public, the public markets or whatever, the the investor market. That's external of, what are the specific challenges that are happening within the company even. That's purely just the size and scale of the company you're dealing with. And I'm using employees as a rubric, but that's not the only. You could think of it sort of, it points to more of like the complexity of the business, right? And so, you could have a 100-person company that has, basically an 80-person engineering, product and engineering team, right? And a 10-person go-to-market team and a 10-person G&A team. That's very different from a complexity standpoint than a 100-person company with a 25-person product and engineering team and a 20-person, sales team and a 10-person marketing team and a, and right? Like those, the latter is obviously a more complex business, right, than the former. So I'm using employees as a crude rule for that. What I think is really difficult, and so for me, what I've had to do through these times, besides that's just the scale change, right? But there's also then the maturity of the business, and then there's this investor, or like the size of capital you're dealing with, and sort of there's the size of the company employees, but then there's sort of like the scope and the reach of the company from a revenue or from a mission standpoint. Um, and then there's just the things that happen, right? Like we've had to do a couple riffs. I had to really reset the culture because I had one really bad hire at one point, and that what I allowed to happen was I allowed a toxicity in the executive team to sort of creep in, and then that spread throughout the company, and so there became this cancer inside the company that I had to fix. And I don't know if I was. It's not clear to me. It wasn't clear to me at the time, even if I was the right person to. But I sort of said, I let this thing happen. I have to fix it, right? So what is important, I think, for founder CEOs, the point of advice I would give is you really have to look in the mirror as a major shareholder in the company at every one of those points in time where there's been a major shift in what your job should be. One, you should surround yourself with people who can help you recognize when that shift has happened, whether it's on your team, on your board, peer group, CEO peer group, advisors, exec coach, whatever it is, who can really say, you know what, like the way you've been operating before needs to change. I can't tell you how it needs to change, but it's going to need to change. And then it's on you to really be honest and look in the mirror and say, one, do I think I can do this, right? Without hubris, like, am I the right person for this or not? And if so, then the next question is, do I want to, right? Because you have to have the aptitude and the attitude, right? Just like, you're hiring yourself at that point. You have to almost like say, I'm a shareholder and founder of the company. I'm a major investor. I'll probably still be on the board no matter what. Would I hire me as the CEO of this company, right? And think about how I hire people. Would I hire them based? Do I think that they're the right person for that job? Do I think that they're going to be all in on it, right? And actually, you have to really be honest with yourself, and that's hard to do. That's really hard to do, to be honest with yourself about that. And I've had to go through a lot of those. Okay, why am I doing this? Why, like, is this the thing that I think I'm good at? Can I learn it? Is there something, would I hire me for this sort of, if it wasn't, if I wasn't sort of default into the position? And then do I really want to do this? Because you have to have the attitude and the desire. Or there's a lot of founders, myself included, who get a huge amount of energy from creating something from nothing, right? And so, yeah, there's like, I have to keep scratching that itch. I've found ways to do that inside the company, right? That isn't disruptive. That is generally speaking, creative. I think most of my team would agree. Most of the time, that sometimes Mark comes in and does disruptive things that are often not good for the company, and other times they are good for the company. But I've found ways to be able to scratch that founder itch while still running a reasonably scaled company.
Yeah. Well, I only have one more question, and this is around, you're still hiring yourself,
Yeah.
and like, what's next? We're living through this AI revolution right
Yeah.
now. It's impacting your business. So where is the founder energy coming from right now?
It's insane. I mean, this stuff. So we acquired this machine learning company in 2021 that now would be called an AI company called Quantify, and then another company in 2022 that had an immense amount of machine learning and what we call sort of AI from a data science and from a training model standpoint. So we've been deep into building AI-like tools, and now a lot of AI-specific tools using third-party LLMs, and whether they're open source or paid, into our suite of products and services. That's from a product standpoint. What over the last 6 to 9 months, we've been just to close on that, and we've been using AI inside the company to improve efficiency as much as possible outside of the product itself for 3 years now, right? At our all company event 3 years ago, we did a hackathon where we were building, AI things in 2023, right? And again, it seems like, oh, that was a really long time ago, right? And it kind of does feel that way, but at the time we're like, oh, this stuff's amazing. And now you look at it, it's so rudimentary. But what you can do today with, with these coding models to build it inside the company is incredible. I mean, it is. I am so incredibly energized by what we can do. We've had a phrase, back to this like "who moved my cheese" to the change thing. A phrase inside the company forever. I mean, since I think we were 5 or 6 people, is Sondermind change is our constant. And that's not like super imaginative or whatever, but it's said all the time. Change is our constant, right? Because we're changing ourselves constantly, and because the market changes, right? The puck moves. Right now, the opportunity for change is it's not just it's exciting, but it's not just, oh, you should think about how can you deploy and utilize AI to reimagine your business. Is that if you're not, you're literally just putting yourself on a path for failure. So I am incredibly excited to be in the seat that I'm in now, because I actually get to think about how would I start this company today, right? Knowing what I know about the company, the industry, and everything else more than I knew 10 years ago, ultimately. And with all these tools at my disposal that didn't exist even 3 or 4 years ago, right? And the energy that creates in me and in the right team members in the company is pretty amazing.
I mean, you can hire a CEO, but you can't hire the founder.
Yeah.
And you're in founder mode right now. So
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time to share this with the audience. And
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, and happy to do this, and thanks for being a great partner.
thank you, Mark.